The evening sky over Meridian Heights bled crimson and gold, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Behind towering iron gates and marble facades, the wealthy lived their carefully orchestrated lives, insulated from the world beyond their perfectly pruned hedges. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, Rebellion wore designer shoes and carried a vintage leather satchel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Ashford pressed her back against the cold stone wall of her family's estate, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The mansion loomed behind her, 37 rooms of suffocating expectation and gilded loneliness. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the glow of her father's study, where Harrison Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries, conducted his empire of steel and technology with the same cold precision he applied to everything else in his life, including her. She clutched the satchel tighter, feeling the weight of the few precious belongings she'd managed to pack. Her mother's journal, the only photo she had of them together before the cancer took her, and the crumpled piece of paper that had started it all, a business card with an address scrawled on the back in her own desperate handwriting. The security cameras swept their mechanical gaze across the gardens, and Victoria knew she had maybe 3 minutes before they rotated back. 3 minutes to cross 20 yards of open ground and slip through the gap in the fence she'd discovered during one of her many lonely walks around the property perimeter. 3 minutes to change her life forever. At 22, Victoria had never made a decision that wasn't filtered through boardroom politics or social climbing strategy. Her father had mapped out every moment of her existence: the right schools, the right friends, the right charities to support for optimal public relations impact. Even her upcoming engagement to Richard Cromwell III, heir to another industrial fortune, had been negotiated like a merger agreement, complete with prenuptial contracts and stock options. But tonight, as autumn wind whispered through the maple trees, carrying with it the scent of freedom and possibility, Victoria chose differently. She ran. Her heels clicked against the cobblestone pathway for exactly 4 steps before she kicked them off, preferring bare feet to the sound that might betray her escape. The grass felt cold and real beneath her toes, more honest than anything she'd experienced in years. Behind her, the mansion's lights blazed like a beacon of everything she was leaving behind. The dinner parties where she smiled until her face ached, the charity galas where she posed for photographs with people who saw her as nothing more than Harrison Ashford's beautiful, obedient daughter. The fence gap was exactly where she remembered it, hidden behind a cluster of overgrown jasmine that the landscaping crew had somehow missed. Victoria squeezed through, feeling the rough metal catch at her silk blouse. A small price for passage to a different world. Silverbrook District sprawled before her like an entirely different planet. Here, the houses wore their age, like comfortable sweaters, paint peeling in places. Gardens wild with the kind of beauty that couldn't be purchased or planned. Porch lights glowed warm and yellow, and through open windows she caught glimpses of real life. Families gathered around dinner tables, children doing homework at kitchen counters. The gentle chaos of people actually living instead of merely existing. Victoria walked the unfamiliar streets with purpose, consulting the address she'd memorized until she could recite it like a prayer. 847 Maple Grove Lane. The home of Sommier de la Vega, single father, construction foreman, and the man who had unknowingly saved her life 3 months ago. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity. Her father had insisted she accompany him to a construction site where Ashford Industries was funding a new community center. It was supposed to be a photo opportunity, a chance for Harrison to demonstrate his commitment to local development. Victoria had stood beside him in her carefully chosen outfit, smiling for the cameras as he delivered his speech about corporate responsibility and community investment. But while the photographers captured their stage benevolence, Victoria's attention had been drawn to a different scene unfolding nearby. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, had scraped her knee on the playground equipment. She was crying, alone, and clearly afraid. While the adults around them focused on business and politics, only one person had noticed her distress. Sommier de la Vega had been working on the construction crew that day, his hands dirty with honest labor, his clothes bearing the evidence of real work. When he saw the injured child, he didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her with the patience of someone who understood that small hurts deserved big attention. Victoria watched from across the yard as he cleaned the scrape with water from his thermos, fashioned a makeshift bandage from his own clean handkerchief, and told the girl a story that made her laugh instead of cry. Then he had done something that stopped Victoria's heart. He had looked around for the child's parents, and finding none immediately nearby, he had simply sat with her on the swing set, pushing her gently while they waited together. No agenda, no photographers, no expectation of recognition or reward. Just one human being caring for another because it was the right thing to do. Victoria had stood frozen, watching this display of simple, honest kindness, and something inside her had cracked open. In Sommier de la Vega's gentle attention to a stranger's child, she had seen everything missing from her own carefully constructed life. She had seen what love looked like when it wasn't calculated for maximum return on investment. Now, 3 months later, she stood at the end of his driveway, staring at a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a vegetable garden sprawling across the front yard. Warm light spilled from the windows, and through the kitchen window, she could see figures moving about, Sommier and his daughter preparing what looked like a simple dinner together. Victoria hesitated at the edge of his property, suddenly aware of how she must look. A young woman in expensive clothes standing barefoot in a working-class neighborhood, clutching a leather bag like a lifeline. She had no plan beyond this moment, no script for what came next. All she knew was that she couldn't return to the golden cage that had been slowly suffocating her soul. She thought of her father, probably just now discovering her absence, likely already calculating the potential scandal and planning damage control strategies. She thought of Richard Cromwell III, who would view her disappearance as a breach of contract rather than a cry for help. She thought of the empty mansion that had never truly been a home, only a showcase for wealth and status. Then she looked again at the warm light emanating from Sommier de la Vega's kitchen window, at the evidence of a life built on love rather than leverage, and she made her choice. Victoria Ashford, daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country, walked up the front steps of 847 Maple Grove Lane and, with trembling fingers, knocked on the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door opened before Victoria could lose her nerve and run back into the night. Sommier de la Vega stood in the doorway, dish towel draped over his shoulder, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and a look of genuine surprise crossing his weathered features. He was taller than she remembered, with kind brown eyes and prematurely gray hair at his temples that spoke of responsibilities shouldered young. Behind him, the warm glow of his home spilled out onto the porch, carrying with it the scent of something homemade and comforting, a stark contrast to the catered meals and sterile dining rooms of her father's world. Victoria started, then stopped, realizing she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head during the walkover, but now that she stood face to face with him, every carefully planned word had abandoned her. She clutched her leather satchel tighter, suddenly aware of how she must appear, barefoot, disheveled, and utterly out of place in this neighborhood of honest living. Sommier's eyes took in her appearance without judgment, the same way she remembered him looking at the injured child that day at the construction site. No calculation, no immediate assumptions, just careful observation and patient attention. His gaze lingered on her bare feet, then traveled to her face, where she knew her carefully applied makeup had been compromised by wind and worry. "You're Harrison Ashford's daughter," he said quietly, not a question but a statement of recognition, "Victoria." She nodded, surprised that he remembered her name. During that photo opportunity 3 months ago, she had been introduced to dozens of people, most of whom had looked through her rather than at her, seeing only her father's extension rather than a person in her own right. "Is everything all right?" Sommier asked, stepping slightly forward but respecting the invisible boundary that her body language had created. There was genuine concern in his voice, the kind that came from someone who noticed when people were hurting and actually cared enough to ask. Before Victoria could answer, a small voice piped up from somewhere behind Sommier's legs. "Daddy, who's at the door? Is it Mrs. Rodriguez with more of her empanadas?" A little girl appeared at Sommier's side, peeking around his frame with curious dark eyes that mirrored her father's warmth. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with braided hair adorned with small butterfly clips and a bright yellow dress that had clearly seen plenty of playground adventures. This had to be Isabella, Somir's daughter, though Victoria only knew her name from overhearing conversations at the construction site. "Not Mrs. Rodriguez tonight, mija," Somir said gently, his hand finding his daughter's shoulder in a protective gesture that was so natural it spoke of years of practice. "This is Miss Victoria. She's a friend of Daddy's from work." Isabella tilted her head with the unfiltered curiosity that only children possessed. "You don't have shoes," she observed matter-of-factly. "Did you lose them?" "I lost my shoes at the park once, but Daddy helped me find them under the slide." Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the magnitude of what she had just done by running away, Victoria found herself smiling at the child's innocent directness. "Something like that," she managed to say, her voice softer than it had been in months. Somir studied Victoria's face more carefully, and she saw the moment when concern shifted to understanding. He might not know the details, but he recognized distress when he saw it. It was probably the same instinct that had led him to help that injured child, the same quality that had drawn Victoria to his doorstep tonight. "Isabella, go wash your hands and check on dinner, okay? I'll be right there." The little girl nodded and skipped back toward what Victoria assumed was the kitchen, her butterfly clips catching the light as she moved. The house seemed to pulse with life in a way that made Victoria's chest ache with longing. With his daughter out of earshot, Somir stepped fully onto the porch, closing the door behind him but not entirely, leaving it cracked so he could still hear Isabella if she needed him. The gesture spoke volumes about the kind of father he was, the kind of man who balanced protection with presence. "I don't know what brought you here tonight," he said quietly, "but you look like someone who's running from something that scared you. Are you safe? Do you need me to call someone?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had asked if she was safe? When was the last time anyone had looked at her and seen a person who might be in need of help rather than an asset to be managed? "I can't go back," Victoria whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can't marry Richard Cromwell. I can't spend another day pretending to be someone I'm not. I can't—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, horrified that she was falling apart on this man's doorstep. Somir didn't try to fix her tears or rush her through her explanation. He simply waited, the same patient presence she had witnessed that day at the construction site. It was the kind of stillness that gave space for truth to emerge. "I know this is crazy," Victoria continued, swiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know you don't know me, and I have no right to show up here like this. But that day at the construction site, when you helped that little girl, you were the first person I'd seen in years who did something kind without calculating what they'd get in return. And I thought, I hoped." She trailed off, realizing how presumptuous she sounded. What had she expected? That a man with his own life, his own responsibilities, would somehow have answers for her privileged girl problems. But Somir didn't look at her like she was a spoiled rich kid having a tantrum. Instead, he leaned against the porch railing, studying her with the same careful attention he'd given the injured child. "You're shivering," he observed. "And you look like you haven't eaten anything substantial in a while." Victoria glanced down at herself, realizing he was right. The silk blouse that had seemed so appropriate for dinner at the mansion was inadequate against the autumn evening, and she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten anything that wasn't picked at during some social obligation. "Isabella made too much spaghetti," Somir said, a statement that they both knew was probably not entirely true, "and we've got an extra jacket hanging by the door. Nothing fancy, but it's warm." It wasn't an invitation to stay, exactly, but it was an offer of immediate comfort from someone who understood that sometimes people needed help before they needed answers. Victoria felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "I don't want to impose on your family dinner." "Isabella loves having company," Somir replied with a small smile, "and she's been practicing her table manners. You'd actually be doing me a favor by giving her someone to impress." Through the cracked door, Victoria could hear the sounds of Isabella moving around the kitchen, humming what sounded like a song from a Disney movie. It was the soundtrack of a real home, a place where an 8-year-old felt safe enough to sing while setting the table. "Just for dinner," Victoria said quietly. "Then I'll figure out what to do next." Somir nodded and opened the door wider, stepping aside to let her enter. "One step at a time," he said. "That's how most problems get solved around here." As Victoria crossed the threshold into Somier de la Vega's home, she felt like she was stepping into an entirely different world, one where kindness wasn't currency and where a man who barely knew her was willing to share his dinner simply because she was hungry and cold. Behind them, the night air carried the distant sound of sirens, and Victoria wondered if her father had already discovered her absence. But for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking 3 steps ahead or calculating consequences. She was simply grateful to be somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere real. The interior of Somier's home wrapped around Victoria like a warm embrace. Everything about it stood in sharp contrast to the cold marble and intimidating grandeur of the Ashford mansion. Here, mismatched furniture told stories of practical purchases and hand-me-downs from family. Crayon drawings were proudly displayed on the refrigerator with colorful magnets, and children's books were scattered across a well-worn coffee table. The walls held framed photographs of Isabella at various ages, gap-toothed grins, birthday parties, father-daughter moments captured in simple joy rather than staged perfection. "Isabella, we have a guest for dinner," Somier announced as they entered the small but cozy kitchen. The space was modest, with pale yellow walls and white cabinets that had clearly seen years of use, but it radiated the kind of warmth that came from being genuinely lived in. Isabella looked up from where she was carefully arranging paper napkins beside mismatched plates, her eyes brightening with excitement. "Really? That's the best surprise ever?" She turned to Victoria with the uninhibited enthusiasm that only children possessed. "Do you like spaghetti? Daddy makes the best sauce in the whole world. He puts secret ingredients in it, but he won't tell me what they are, even though I've asked like 1,000,000 times." Victoria found herself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. "I love spaghetti. And I'm very good at keeping secrets, so maybe if you ask really nicely, he'll tell us both." "Daddy never tells," Isabella said with the dramatic sigh of someone who had clearly waged this battle before. "But maybe if there were 2 of us asking." She shot her father a hopeful look that made Victoria's heart ache with its sweetness. Somier chuckled, reaching into a closet near the back door and retrieving a worn denim jacket. "Here," he said, offering it to Victoria. "It's not much, but it'll help with the cold." The jacket was too big for her, sleeves hanging past her fingertips, but it was soft with age and smelled faintly of sawdust and something distinctly masculine, not expensive cologne, but honest work and gentle living. Victoria pulled it around herself gratefully, feeling more comfortable than she had in any designer outfit. "Can I set another place?" Isabella asked, already reaching for the cabinet where the dishes were kept. Without waiting for an answer, she climbed onto a small step stool and carefully selected a plate that matched nothing else on the table but somehow fit perfectly with the eclectic charm of the household. As Somier stirred the sauce on the stove, Victoria noticed the easy rhythm between father and daughter. There were no raised voices, no tension, no underlying current of criticism or expectation. Isabella chattered about her day at school, describing an art project involving papier-mâché and glitter with the kind of detail that made even the mundane sound magical. Somier listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering encouragement in a way that made it clear his daughter's thoughts and feelings mattered to him. "We're studying butterflies in science class," Isabella explained to Victoria as she carefully folded napkins. "Did you know that some butterflies migrate thousands of miles? Teacher says they have an internal compass, like they just know where they're supposed to go even if they've never been there before." Victoria accepted the napkin Isabella handed her, struck by the metaphor. "That's amazing. Do you think people have internal compasses too?" Isabella tilted her head thoughtfully, considering this with the seriousness she might give to any important question. "Maybe. Daddy always says that when you're lost, you have to be still and listen to your heart. Maybe that's the same thing." The simple wisdom of an 8-year-old hit Victoria with unexpected force. When was the last time she had been still enough to listen to anything, let alone her heart? Her entire life had been scheduled, planned, and orchestrated by others. Even her rebellion tonight had been more about running away from something than running toward anything. "Your daddy sounds very wise," Victoria said softly. "He is," quote, Isabella agreed with absolute confidence. "He knows how to fix broken things and make sad people feel better." Last week, Mrs. Chen from down the street was crying because her garden got ruined in that big storm, And Daddy spent his whole Saturday helping her replant everything. He didn't even know her very well, but he said that's what neighbors do. Somir shot his daughter a look that was equal parts embarrassment and pride. Isabella likes to make me sound more heroic than I actually am. It's not heroic to help people, Isabella protested. It's just what you do. Like when you helped that lady at the grocery store reach the stuff on the high shelf, or when you taught Mr. Martinez how to use his new phone, or when you… Misha, maybe Victoria doesn't need to hear about every good deed. Somir interrupted gently, but Victoria could see he was touched by his daughter's pride in him. I do, actually, Victoria said quietly. It sounds like you live in a very different world than I'm used to. Somir glanced at her curiously, but didn't press for details. Instead, he began serving the spaghetti onto plates. The simple domestic task, somehow elegant in its unpretentiousness. Everyone's world is different, he said. The trick is figuring out which world you actually want to live in. They sat down at the small round table, Isabella launching immediately into a detailed explanation of her butterfly project, while Victoria marveled at the normalcy of it all. The spaghetti was indeed excellent. Rich and flavorful in a way that spoke of time and care, rather than expensive ingredients. The conversation flowed naturally, with no awkward silences or performative pleasantries. For the first time in years, Victoria found herself relaxing completely. She didn't have to monitor her posture or choose her words carefully, or smile at precisely the right moments. She could simply be present, listening to Isabella's stories and watching the easy affection between father and daughter. Victoria, do you have any brothers or sisters? Isabella asked between bites, sauce adorning her chin in a way that would have horrified the social coordinators at any Ashford Industries event. No, it's just me, Victoria replied, realizing how lonely that sounded when spoken aloud. That must be so quiet, Isabella said with genuine sympathy. I always wanted a sister, someone to share secrets with and braid hair and have tea parties. Daddy tries, but he's not very good at tea parties. He always uses the wrong voice for the stuffed animals. Victoria glanced at Somia, who shrugged good-naturedly. Apparently my British accent needs work. It's terrible, Isabella confirmed with brutal 8-year-old honesty. But he makes up for it by reading the best bedtime stories. He does all the voices, and sometimes he makes up new endings if the real endings are too sad. The picture Isabella painted of their life together, simple, loving, filled with small traditions and genuine care, made Victoria's throat tight with emotion. This was what family looked like when it wasn't a business arrangement or a public relations strategy. This was what love looked like when it was freely given rather than conditionally earned. As they finished dinner, Isabella began clearing plates with the practiced efficiency of someone who had regular chores and took them seriously. Victoria started to help, but Sommier gently waved her back into her seat. You're a guest tonight, he said. Rest. But Isabella had other ideas. Can Victoria help me with dishes? Please, Daddy. I never get to show anyone how good I am at washing the glasses without breaking them. Sommier looked to Victoria, who nodded eagerly. I'd love to help. Standing side by side at the sink, Isabella chattering about proper soap-to-water ratios while Victoria carefully dried each piece, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Belonging. Not the hollow belonging that came from wearing the right clothes to the right events, but genuine acceptance into a moment of ordinary life. As they worked, Victoria caught glimpses of Sommier watching them with a soft expression she couldn't quite interpret. There was something protective in his gaze, but also something like understanding, as if he recognized that she needed this simple normalcy as much as she needed the warm jacket and hot meal. When the dishes were done and Isabella had been coaxed into starting her homework at the kitchen table, Sommier poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for Victoria to join him on the small back porch. The night air was crisp but not uncomfortable, and the modest backyard stretched before them, dominated by what appeared to be a carefully tended vegetable garden and a swing set that had seen better days but was clearly still beloved. This is nice, Victoria said quietly, cradling the warm mug between her hands. Peaceful. Sommier nodded, settling into one of 2 mismatched chairs. It's not much, but it's ours. Isabella and I, we've built something good here. Victoria heard the subtle emphasis on built and understood that whatever life they had created hadn't come easily. There were stories in the careful way he spoke about their home, in the practiced efficiency with which he managed dinner time and homework, in the deep bond between father and daughter that spoke of someone who had been both parents for a while. "She's wonderful," Victoria said. "Isabella, you can see how much she loves you." "She's the best thing that ever happened to me," Somir replied without hesitation. "Everything I do, every choice I make, it's all for her. To give her the kind of childhood where she feels safe enough to sing in the kitchen and confident enough to invite strangers to help with dishes." The simple profundity of his words settled over Victoria like a blanket. Here was a man who measured success not in stock prices or social status, but in his daughter's ability to feel secure in her own home. It was a completely foreign concept to someone who had grown up as a chess piece in her father's empire-building strategy. As if summoned by their conversation, Isabella's voice drifted through the screen door. "Daddy, I finished my math homework. Can I read for 20 minutes before bath time?" "Sure, Misha. Pick out a book and I'll be in to listen soon." Victoria watched as shadows moved past the kitchen window. Isabella, presumably settling in with a book. "You read with her every night?" "When I can. Sometimes work runs late, but I try to be here for the important stuff. Homework, dinner, bedtime stories. The little things that add up to a childhood." The little things that add up to a childhood. Victoria thought about her own childhood. Boarding schools and nannies. Achievements celebrated with expensive gifts rather than presents. Love expressed through opportunities rather than attention. She had been given every advantage money could buy, but she had never experienced anything like the simple security Isabella took for granted. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for letting me stay for dinner, for not asking too many questions, for this." She gestured vaguely at the house, the evening, the unexpected refuge she had offered. Somir studied her for a moment in the dim porch light. "Whatever brought you here tonight, whatever you're running from, you don't have to figure it all out right now. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just rest for a while, get your strength back before you decide what comes next." It was exactly what she needed to hear, and somehow exactly what she hadn't known she needed to hear. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria felt like she could simply breathe. Victoria woke to the sound of gentle laughter and the smell of pancakes drifting through the small guest room where she had spent the night. For a moment she lay still beneath the handmade quilt, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and children's artwork decorated every available surface. Clearly Isabella's former room before she had graduated to the larger bedroom down the hall. The morning light filtering through simple white curtains felt different from the harsh brightness that typically flooded her suite at the Ashford mansion. Here, even the sunlight seemed gentler, more welcoming. Victoria stretched, realizing she had slept more soundly than she had in months, free from the anxiety that usually plagued her nights. Last evening felt like a dream now. The impulsive escape, the terrifying walk through unfamiliar streets, the moment of desperate courage that had led her to knock on Somir's door. When she had finally admitted she had nowhere else to go, he had simply nodded and shown her to this room, offering clean towels and an old t-shirt to sleep in, without making her feel like a burden or an intruder. "No pressure," he had said quietly. "Tomorrow will look different than today, it always does." Now, pulling on her wrinkled clothes from the night before, Victoria felt the truth of those words. The overwhelming panic that had driven her here had settled into something more manageable. Still uncertain, still frightening, but no longer paralyzing. She made her way to the kitchen, where she found Somir standing at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes while Isabella sat at the table, already dressed for school, carefully cutting her breakfast into perfect triangular pieces. "Good morning," Somir said, glancing over his shoulder with a warm smile. "I hope we didn't wake you." Isabella's internal alarm clock doesn't understand the concept of sleeping in. "I wake up at 6:30 every day," Isabella announced proudly, "even on weekends. Daddy says it's because I'm excited about life." Victoria found herself smiling at the child's enthusiasm. "That's a wonderful way to look at it. At my house, I used to sleep until noon whenever I could, just to avoid." She stopped herself, realizing she was about to complain about her privileged life to people who probably started their days at dawn out of necessity, not choice. But Somir didn't seem to judge her unfinished sentence. Instead, he set a plate of golden pancakes in front of her, the stack perfectly formed and smelling like vanilla and cinnamon. "Sometimes sleep is the only escape we have," he said simply. until we find something worth waking up for." The observation was gentle but perceptive, and Victoria realized he understood more about her situation than she had revealed. She took a bite of the pancakes. Homemade, clearly, and infinitely better than anything the Ashford family chef had ever prepared. "These are incredible," she said, meaning it completely. "Secret ingredient," Isabella whispered conspiratorially, leaning across the table. "Daddy puts a tiny bit of orange zest in the batter. He taught me how to use the little grater thingy, but I'm only allowed to do it when he's watching, because it's super sharp." Victoria watched the easy interaction between father and daughter, the way Sommier included Isabella in the cooking process while keeping her safe, the way he had clearly been teaching her life skills alongside life lessons. It was such a different approach to parenting than what she had experienced, less about preparing her for public presentation and more about preparing her for authentic living. "I have to go to work today," Sommier said, settling into his chair with his own plate. "Construction crew starts early, but Isabella doesn't get picked up for school until 8:15, so you two will have some time together if that's okay." Victoria felt a flutter of panic. She had never been solely responsible for a child, even for a short period. At the Ashford mansion, there had always been nannies, tutors, and staff to handle such responsibilities. "I don't know much about taking care of kids," she admitted. "I'm 8, Isabella said matter-of-factly. "I mostly take care of myself. I just need someone to make sure I remember my backpack and my lunchbox, and to lock the door when Mrs. Patterson comes to get me." The trust Sommier was placing in her felt both terrifying and oddly honoring. He barely knew her, yet he was comfortable leaving his most precious possession in her care, even briefly. It spoke to an openness and faith in human nature that Victoria found both foreign and deeply moving. "Mrs. Patterson is our neighbor," Sommier explained. "She drives Isabella to school on her way to work. She's been helping us out since." He paused, and Victoria caught something unspoken in his expression. "Since it's just been the two of us." Victoria wanted to ask about Isabella's mother, about the story behind Sommier's single parenthood, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't a conversation for a busy morning with little ears present. After Sommier left for work, his departure marked by a tender kiss on Isabella's forehead and a gentle squeeze of Victoria's shoulder, the house settled into a different rhythm. Isabella moved through her morning routine with impressive independence, brushing her teeth, gathering her school supplies, and checking her homework folder with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to be responsible for herself. "Do you want to see my butterfly project?" Isabella asked, pulling out a carefully constructed poster board covered in pictures, facts, and colorful drawings. "I have to present it today, and I'm a little nervous." Victoria studied the project with genuine interest. It was clearly the work of a bright child who had taken the assignment seriously, with hand-drawn diagrams of butterfly life cycles and neatly printed facts about migration patterns. "This is amazing, Isabella. You should be proud of this work." "Really? It's not too messy?" "Jessica Anderson always has the perfect projects because her mom helps her with everything. Mine are just mine." The wistful note in Isabella's voice tugged at Victoria's heart. She knelt down to the child's level, studying the project more carefully. "Isabella, do you know what makes this special? It's authentic. Every drawing, every word, every idea came from you. That's worth so much more than perfect." Isabella's face brightened. "Daddy always says that too. He says my best is always good enough, even if it doesn't look like everyone else's." Victoria felt another pang of recognition. When had anyone ever told her that her best was enough? Her achievements had always been measured against impossible standards, her worth determined by how well she performed in comparison to others. As they waited for Mrs. Patterson, Isabella chattered about her friends, her teacher, her plans for recess. Victoria found herself genuinely engaged in the conversation, asking questions and offering encouragement in a way that felt natural and unforced. There was something refreshing about Isabella's perspective on the world. Everything was interesting. Every experience held potential for wonder or learning. When Mrs. Patterson arrived, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who greeted Victoria with curious but friendly eyes, Isabella hugged Victoria goodbye with spontaneous affection. "Will you be here when I get home?" she asked, hopefully. Victoria glanced at Mrs. Patterson, suddenly aware that her presence here was creating questions in the neighborhood. Potential complications for Somier's carefully constructed life. "I'm not sure, sweetheart, we'll see." After they left, Victoria found herself alone in Somier's house for the first time. She wandered through the small rooms, not snooping but simply observing the life that had been built here. Every surface told a story of father and daughter creating a world together. Framed certificates of Isabella's achievements, photos of camping trips and birthday parties, a bookshelf filled with children's classics and adult novels in both English and Spanish. On Somier's dresser, she noticed a single photograph of a beautiful Latina woman holding a baby Isabella. The woman's eyes held the same warmth as her daughter's, and something in her smile suggested she had been the kind of person who made everyone around her feel special. Victoria stared at the photo for a long moment, understanding instinctively that this was Isabella's mother, and that her absence explained the particular closeness between father and daughter. The realization made Victoria feel like an intruder in their carefully preserved world. What right did she have to disrupt the peaceful life they had built together? What could she possibly offer that would justify the complications her presence might bring? Her phone, which she had turned off the night before, buzzed insistently from her purse. With trembling fingers, she powered it on to find dozens of missed calls and text messages. Her father, Richard, family attorneys, even her personal assistant, all demanding to know where she was, all expressing varying degrees of anger, concern, and ultimatum. The final message from her father's personal number was simple and chilling: "Come home immediately, or face the consequences of your actions. This embarrassment ends now." Victoria stared at the screen, feeling the walls of her old life closing in even from a distance. She thought about the warm breakfast she had shared that morning, about Isabella's nervous excitement over her butterfly project, about Somier's quiet strength and unconditional acceptance. Then she thought about the cold marble halls of the Ashford mansion, about the engagement party being planned for next month, about a future that felt like a beautiful prison. For the first time since arriving at Somier's doorstep, Victoria began to understand that her impulsive escape had been more than just running away from something. It had been running toward a life she had never known was possible. The question now was whether she was brave enough to choose it, and whether she had the right to involve Somier and Isabella in the inevitable storm that choice would bring. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the kitchen window like butterflies, following their own internal compass toward something they had never seen but somehow knew they needed to find. 3 days had passed since Victoria's impulsive escape, and she had somehow found herself settling into the rhythm of life at 847 Maple Grove Lane. What had begun as a desperate flight from her predetermined future was slowly transforming into something she had never experienced before. A sense of belonging that came not from obligation or expectation, but from genuine contribution to something meaningful. This morning, she stood in the kitchen of Silverbrook Elementary School's after-school program, wearing an apron borrowed from the director and surrounded by the cheerful chaos of 20 children preparing snacks for their younger classmates. Isabella had mentioned during breakfast that the school was short-staffed for their community service program, and, without really thinking it through, Victoria had volunteered to help. "Miss Victoria, I can't reach the peanut butter," called out Marcus, a freckled 10-year-old who had appointed himself her assistant for the sandwich-making assembly line they had organized. "Here you go," Victoria said, lifting the jar down from the high shelf. "Remember, we're making sandwiches for the kids who might not have lunch today, so let's make them extra special." The concept of food insecurity had been entirely abstract to Victoria until Isabella had explained it with the matter-of-fact compassion of a child who understood that some of her classmates went home to empty refrigerators. "Daddy says everyone deserves to feel full and happy," Isabella had said. "That's why we always pack extra fruit snacks in my lunchbox, in case someone needs them." Now, watching Marcus carefully spread peanut butter with the concentration of a surgeon, Victoria felt a purpose she had never experienced in any of the charity galas or fundraising events she had attended with her father. Those had been performances, opportunities for networking and public relations. This was different. This was about directly meeting a need, about seeing the immediate impact of small acts of kindness. "My mom used to make sandwiches like this when I was little," said Sophia, a quiet girl with serious eyes who was meticulously arranging apple slices. "She said love was the secret ingredient that made them taste better." Victoria paused in her own sandwich construction, touched by the girl's words. "Your mom sounds very wise. What other secret ingredients do you think we should add?" "Hope," suggested Marcus immediately. "And maybe some happiness." "Definitely happiness," agreed Isabella. who was working at the next station, her butterfly clips catching the afternoon light streaming through the classroom windows. And maybe some of that feeling you get when someone remembers your birthday. Victoria found herself smiling as she spread jam on slice after slice of bread, adding what she privately thought of as generous helpings of all the secret ingredients the children had suggested. Around her, the conversation flowed naturally between the kids. Discussions of homework and playground politics mixed with innocent wisdom about kindness and community. "Miss Victoria," called out Emma, a shy third grader who had barely spoken when Victoria first arrived, "are you Isabella's new mom?" The question hung in the air for a moment, causing several children to look up from their work with curious expressions. Victoria felt her cheeks warm, suddenly aware that her presence in Isabella's life over the past few days had created assumptions and questions she hadn't considered. "Emma," Isabella protested, though not unkindly, "Miss Victoria is our friend. She's staying with us for a little while." "But she makes breakfast with your dad," Emma persisted with the relentless logic of an 8-year-old. "And she walks you to the bus stop. And she helped you practice your butterfly presentation yesterday." Victoria realized that in the simple acts of daily life, sharing meals, helping with homework, participating in morning routines, she had unconsciously been filling a role that the children naturally recognized, even if the adults hadn't labeled it. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "Miss Victoria is very special to us," Isabella said diplomatically, shooting Victoria a smile that somehow managed to be both innocent and knowing. "She's teaching me about fancy table manners and how to braid hair in complicated ways." This was news to Victoria, who had attempted to French braid Isabella's hair that morning with decidedly amateur results. But Isabella had worn the lopsided creation with pride, declaring it, quote, "elegant and unique." As they finished preparing the sandwiches, Mrs. Chen, the program director, approached with a warm smile. "Victoria, I can't thank you enough for jumping in like this. The children have been talking about you all week. You have a natural way with them." "They're easy to love," Victoria replied, surprised by how naturally the words came. "They see the world with such hope and generosity. It's inspiring." "Isabella is lucky to have you in her life," Mrs. Chen continued. "Single parents need all the support they can get, and it's clear you care deeply about both her and her father." Victoria felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came whenever someone acknowledged her growing attachment to this life she had stumbled into. What right did she have to insert herself into Sommier and Isabella's world? What would happen when her father inevitably tracked her down? What kind of disruption would her presence ultimately bring to the peaceful life they had built together? But before she could spiral into overthinking, Isabella appeared at her elbow with a completed sandwich held up for inspection. "Look, Miss Victoria, I made this one extra special because it's going to Tommy Rodriguez, and he always shares his cookies with me at lunch, even though I know his abuela only packs him too." The simple generosity behind Isabella's gesture, recognizing another child's kindness and wanting to reciprocate, reminded Victoria of why she was here. Not because she was running from something, but because she had found something worth staying for. After the program ended and they had walked home together, Victoria found herself genuinely looking forward to Sommier's return from work. The anticipation felt different from anything she had experienced before. Not the nervous energy of needing to perform or meet expectations, but the simple pleasure of sharing the day's experiences with someone who would genuinely want to hear them. When Sommier's truck pulled into the driveway, Isabella ran to meet him with the enthusiasm of someone whose day wasn't complete until she could tell her favorite person everything that had happened. Victoria watched from the front porch as he scooped his daughter into a hug, listening to her excited recounting of the sandwich project and her successful butterfly presentation. And Miss Victoria helped Mrs. Chen organize everything, and Marcus said she should be a teacher because she's really good at explaining stuff, and Emma asked if she was my new mom, but I told her she's our special friend, and we made 47 sandwiches and I counted them twice to make sure. Isabella finished breathlessly. Sommier's eyes found Victoria's over his daughter's head, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Gratitude, certainly, but also something deeper. A recognition of the way she had seamlessly woven herself into the fabric of their daily life, not as an outsider trying to fit in, but as someone who belonged there naturally. "Sounds like you two had quite an adventure," he said, setting Isabella down and approaching the porch with that easy smile that had become so familiar over the past few days. "The best kind," Victoria replied, "the kind where you help people and everyone feels good afterward." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing the day's stories, Victoria realized something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer thinking about this experience as temporary, as a brief escape from her real life. This was starting to feel like her real life. The conversations that mattered, the connections that fed her soul, the purpose that gave meaning to her days. Isabella's innocent question from the afternoon echoed in her mind. Are you Isabella's new mom? The child had seen what the adults were still cautious about, acknowledging that Victoria had found her place in this family, not through formal arrangement or legal documentation, but through the simple act of showing up consistently with love and care. When Somir helped Isabella with her math homework at the kitchen table, Victoria found herself naturally taking on the role of preparing tomorrow's lunch, adding extra fruit snacks, just as Isabella had taught her. When Isabella needed help reaching something in her bedroom, Victoria was the one she called. When bedtime came and Isabella requested a story, she asked for one that included all three of them, Daddy, Isabella, and Miss Victoria, going on adventures together. As Victoria tucked the quilt around Isabella's sleeping form later that evening, she realized that for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to be needed, not for what she could provide or represent, but simply for who she was. In helping others, she had discovered a version of herself she never knew existed, someone capable of nurturing, of contributing, of building, rather than simply inheriting. The phone in her purse buzzed again with another message from her father, but for the first time since leaving the mansion, Victoria didn't feel the familiar twist of anxiety in her stomach. Whatever storm was coming, she was no longer the same person who had fled in desperation 3 nights ago. She had found something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, and most surprisingly, she had found that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Victoria was in the middle of helping Isabella with her science fair project when the black SUVs arrived. They came like a storm front rolling across the peaceful neighborhood, 3 sleek vehicles that looked as out of place on Maple Grove Lane as diamonds scattered on a construction site. She saw them through the living room window first, the gleaming chrome and tinted glass that screamed corporate power and unlimited resources. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Isabella," she said quietly, trying to keep the panic from her voice, "why don't you go to your room and work on coloring that butterfly diagram we started yesterday?" The 8-year-old looked up from where she was carefully gluing cotton balls to a poster board about cloud formations, her dark eyes immediately picking up on the tension in Victoria's voice. "Is everything okay, Miss Victoria?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just need you to go upstairs for a few minutes, okay?" Isabella nodded, gathering her art supplies with the unquestioning obedience of a child who trusted the adults in her life to handle whatever needed handling. But Victoria caught the worried glance she threw toward the window before disappearing up the stairs, and her heart clenched with the realization that her presence here was about to shatter the peaceful world this little girl had known. The cars came to a synchronized stop in front of the house, their engines purring with the quiet menace of expensive machinery. Victoria watched as men in dark suits emerged, her father's security team, lawyers, and finally, Harrison Ashford himself. Even at a distance, even through the modest front window of a working-class home, her father commanded attention. He stood on the sidewalk in his perfectly tailored coat, his silver hair catching the afternoon light, surveying Somir's humble property with the cold assessment of someone calculating its net worth down to the last shingle. Victoria's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and dialed Somir's number. He was still at the construction site, wouldn't be home for another hour, but she needed to warn him about what was coming. "Hey," his warm voice answered after 2 rings. "Everything okay? You sound—" "My father's here," Victoria interrupted, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out. "He found me. He's outside with lawyers and security, and I don't know what he's going to do, but Somir, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to bring this to your door." "Victoria, breathe." Somir's voice cut through her panic with steady calm. "Take a deep breath. Is Isabella safe?" "She's upstairs. I sent her to her room." "Good. That's good. Now listen to me. You don't have to go with them if you don't want to. You're an adult. You have choices." The simple reminder that she had agency in this situation helped slow her racing heart slightly, but before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Not the gentle tap of a neighbor or the casual rhythm of someone familiar. This was the authoritative rap of people accustomed to having doors opened immediately. "He's at the door," Victoria whispered. "I'm leaving work now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. You don't have to face this alone." But even as Somir spoke, Victoria knew that 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. Her father wasn't the kind of man who waited for anyone, and he certainly wouldn't respect the boundaries of a home that represented everything he considered beneath his notice. The knocking came again, more insistent now, followed by a voice she recognized as belonging to her father's head of security. "Miss Ashford, we know you're in there. Please open the door." Victoria moved toward the front entrance on unsteady legs, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. What would happen to Somir if she didn't comply? What kind of trouble could her father cause for a single father who had simply offered kindness to a stranger? What would happen to Isabella if this escalated into something ugly? She opened the door to find Harrison Ashford standing on the modest front porch, looking like a general surveying conquered territory. Behind him, his security team maintained strategic positions while two men in expensive suits, lawyers undoubtedly, flanked him like bookends. The contrast between their corporate armor and the simple, welcoming front porch decorated with Isabella's chalk drawings was jarring. "Victoria," her father said, his voice carrying the particular tone he used in boardrooms when he was about to deliver an ultimatum. "Enough of this nonsense. Get your things. We're leaving." "Hello, Dad?" Victoria replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Would you like to come in? I could make coffee." Harrison's eyes narrowed at her casual tone, clearly not the response he had expected. "I'm not here for social pleasantries. This stunt of yours has gone on long enough. Do you have any idea the damage you've done? The questions being asked? The speculation in the media?" "I've been volunteering at an elementary school and helping a little girl with her homework," Victoria said quietly. "I can't imagine what damage that could possibly cause." "Don't be naive," Harrison snapped. "The daughter of Harrison Ashford doesn't simply disappear without consequences. The engagement announcement was scheduled for this weekend. Richard's family is asking questions. The board is concerned about your stability." "Maybe their concerns are justified," Victoria said, feeling a strange calm settle over her. "Maybe I am unstable by their standards. Maybe choosing kindness over profit margins is a form of insanity in your world." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "Miss Ashford, perhaps we could discuss this more privately. There are considerations regarding your trust fund, your position in the company, your future financial security." Victoria understood the implicit threat: comply or face the financial consequences of her rebellion. It was the same leverage her father had always used, the golden handcuffs that had kept her compliant for 22 years. "Who lives here?" Harrison demanded, his gaze sweeping over the small front yard with its carefully tended flower beds and Isabella's swing set. "What kind of people have you been associating with?" "Good people," Victoria said firmly, "the kind who help injured children without calculating what they'll get in return, the kind who share their dinner with strangers, the kind who measure success by whether their daughter feels safe enough to sing in the kitchen." "Romantic nonsense," Harrison dismissed. "Real life requires real decisions, Victoria. Practical choices. You can't play house forever with people who— "Who what?" Victoria interrupted, feeling anger flare hot in her chest. "Who work honest jobs? Who raise their children with love instead of leverage? Who build something meaningful instead of just accumulating more zeros in their bank accounts?" The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted their increasingly heated exchange. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who drove Isabella to school, was returning from her afternoon walk, her elderly face creased with concern as she took in the scene of expensive cars and suited men confronting Victoria. "Everything all right here, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her tone polite but protective. Harrison barely glanced at the older woman. "This is a private family matter. This is a neighborhood that looks out for each other," Mrs. Patterson replied with the quiet steel of someone who had raised 5 children and wasn't easily intimidated. "Victoria, honey, do you need anything?" The simple question, offered without calculation or agenda, reminded Victoria of everything she had discovered in this place. Community, genuine care, people who noticed when others needed help and offered it freely. "I'm okay, Mrs. Patterson," Victoria said. "Thank you for checking." But as she spoke, she caught sight of movement in an upstairs window, Isabella's small face peering down at the scene below, her eyes wide with confusion and worry. The sight of the child's distress cut through Victoria's newfound resolve like a knife. This was exactly what she had feared. Her presence here, her selfish desire for a different kind of life, was bringing chaos and uncertainty into the peaceful world Sommier had built for his daughter. Isabella was watching strangers in suits invade her safe space, seeing the woman she had begun to trust arguing with intimidating men in expensive clothes. Harrison followed her gaze to the window. "There's a child involved in this?" His voice carried a new edge of calculation. "Victoria, you're not just jeopardizing your own future now. Your choices have consequences for others." The implied threat was crystal clear. Her father had the resources and connections to make life very difficult for anyone who got in his way. A single father working construction, a little girl who needed stability, they would be collateral damage in Harrison Ashford's campaign to retrieve his wayward daughter. Victoria felt the walls of her old life closing in around her, but now they weren't just trapping her. They were threatening to crush the people she had come to love. "You have 5 minutes to get your belongings," Harrison said, checking his expensive watch with theatrical precision. "Then we're leaving, with or without your cooperation." Upstairs, Isabella's face disappeared from the window, and Victoria heard the soft sound of a bedroom door closing. The child was hiding, probably confused and frightened by the invasion of her peaceful afternoon. Victoria thought about Sommier racing home from work, about the man who had opened his door to a stranger and asked nothing in return except honesty. She thought about Isabella's trust, about morning pancakes and bedtime stories, and the simple magic of being needed for who she was rather than what she represented. Then she thought about her father's resources, about what he could do to destroy the life they had built together if she continued to defy him. For the first time since arriving at 847 Maple Grove Lane, Victoria felt truly trapped. Victoria stood frozen on the threshold, her father's ultimatum hanging in the air like a blade ready to fall. The 5 minutes he had given her felt both endless and impossibly brief. Inside the house, she could hear the muffled sound of Isabella's footsteps moving around her bedroom, probably packing away her science project to keep it safe from whatever was happening downstairs. The thought of that small act, a child protecting her schoolwork while adults argued about her future, nearly broke Victoria's resolve entirely. 4 minutes, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the same dispassionate precision he used during hostile takeovers. But before Victoria could move toward the stairs to gather her few belongings, the rumble of Sommier's truck cut through the suburban afternoon quiet. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him turn into the driveway, his old Ford pickup looking like a toy next to the sleek corporate vehicles that had invaded his street. Sommier emerged from the truck with deliberate calm, his work boots solid against the pavement, his flannel shirt and tool belt marking him as clearly as Harrison's suit marked him. Victoria watched her two worlds collide in the space of a suburban driveway, corporate power meeting honest labor, manipulation confronting authenticity. "Gentlemen," Sommier said, nodding politely to the security team before his eyes found Victoria's face. She saw him take in her pallor, the tension in her shoulders, the barely controlled panic in her expression. "Is there a problem here?" Harrison turned to assess this new player in his carefully orchestrated scene. Victoria watched her father's gaze catalog everything about Sommier. The calloused hands, the modest truck, the small house that probably cost less than Harrison spent on a weekend at the family's Martha's Vineyard estate. "You must be the homeowner," Harrison said, his tone carrying the particular condescension he reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. "I'm Harrison Ashford. I'm here to collect my daughter." "I know who you are," Sommier replied evenly. "I also know Victoria is 22 years old and capable of making her own decisions about where she wants to be." One of the lawyers stepped forward, briefcase in hand like a weapon. "Mr. De La Vega, I presume? You should be aware that harboring Miss Ashford could be construed as—" "As what?" Sommier interrupted, his voice still calm but gaining an edge of steel. "Offering hospitality to someone who needed help, making sure a young woman had a safe place to sleep and warm meals. Where I come from, we call that being a decent human being." Victoria felt something crack open in her chest at the quiet dignity of his defense. No one had ever stood up for her like this. Not as Harrison Ashford's daughter, not as a business asset or a marriage prospect, but as a person deserving of respect and protection. "Mr. De La Vega," Harrison said, his patience clearly wearing thin, "I'm sure you mean well, but you don't understand the complexities of the situation. Victoria has responsibilities, commitments, a life that extends far beyond whatever sanctuary you've provided her. Daddy? Isabella's voice drifted down from the upstairs window, small and uncertain. Is everything okay? The sound of his daughter's worry transformed something in Somir's expression. Victoria watched as the protective instincts that had shaped every decision of his adult life engaged fully. This wasn't just about defending Victoria anymore. This was about protecting his child from the chaos that had invaded their peaceful world. Everything's fine, mija, Somir called up to the window. Stay in your room for a few more minutes, okay? Harrison seized on the moment with the calculated precision of a predator sensing weakness. You have a daughter to consider, Mr. De La Vega. A young child who depends on you for stability. Are you really prepared to risk her security for someone you've known less than a week? Victoria saw the blow land exactly as her father had intended. Somir's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his features. Harrison had found his target, the one thing that could make this good man question his instincts to help someone in need. What kind of risk? Somir asked quietly. One of the lawyers opened his briefcase with theatrical efficiency. Legal complications, Mr. De La Vega. Questions about your fitness as a guardian. Background checks that might reveal inconsistencies in your employment history, your financial stability. The kind of scrutiny that social services takes very seriously when determining whether a child is in a suitable environment. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Her father was threatening Isabella, not directly, but with the kind of bureaucratic warfare that could tear apart a family through 1,000 small cuts. A single father working construction would be vulnerable to exactly the kind of harassment Harrison's legal team could orchestrate. That's enough, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the autumn air with surprising strength. She stepped off the porch, placing herself physically between her father's men and Somir's front door. You want me to come with you? Fine. But you leave them alone. Completely alone. Victoria, no, Somir said, moving toward her. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she replied, turning to face him with tears she refused to let fall. You heard him. He'll destroy everything you've built here. He'll hurt Isabella just to get to me. I won't let that happen. But Somir stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level meant only for her ears. What about what you want? What about the life you're trying to build? I can't build happiness on the ruins of yours, Victoria whispered back. Isabella needs stability. She needs safety. She needs her father to be free to take care of her without worrying about lawyers and social services and all the ways my father can make your life hell. From the upstairs window, Isabella's voice came again, more insistent now. Daddy, who are those men? Why is Miss Victoria crying? The sound of the child's distress was like a knife through Victoria's heart. This was exactly what she had feared from the beginning, that her selfish desire for a different life would bring pain to people who had shown her nothing but kindness. 2 minutes, Harrison announced, checking his watch again. Mrs. Patterson had been joined by other neighbors now. Mr. Chen from 3 houses down, the young mother from across the street with her toddler on her hip, an elderly man walking his dog who had stopped to observe the scene with obvious concern. The quiet street had become an impromptu gathering of people who cared about Somir and Isabella, who recognized that something important was at stake. This is a good neighborhood, Mrs. Patterson said firmly to no one in particular, but clearly for Harrison's benefit. Good people who look out for each other. We don't appreciate strangers coming here making threats. No one is making threats, one of the lawyers replied smoothly. We're simply collecting Miss Ashford and resolving a family matter. Looks like threatening to me, Mr. Chen observed. All these fancy cars, all these suits. Looks like intimidation to a working man. Victoria saw her father's expression tighten with irritation. He wasn't accustomed to pushback from people he considered irrelevant, wasn't prepared for a community that would rally around one of their own. In his world, power was about isolation, about having enough money and influence to operate above the concerns of ordinary people. But this wasn't his world. This was Maple Grove Lane, where neighbors noticed when children were upset, and where good men like Somir De La Vega had built lives based on love rather than leverage. Time's up, Harrison announced. Victoria, get in the car. Now. Victoria looked up at Isabella's window one last time, seeing the small face pressed against the glass, watching the woman she had come to trust being taken away by strangers in expensive suits. The image would haunt her forever, a child's confusion and fear written across features that should have known only security and joy. She thought about morning pancakes and bedtime stories, about science projects and volunteer work that actually mattered. She thought about Somir's patient kindness and Isabella's innocent wisdom about butterflies finding their way home. Then she thought about her father's resources, about what he could do to this family if she continued to resist. "I need to say goodbye," Victoria said quietly. Harrison nodded curtly. "Make it quick." Victoria walked toward Somir, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. When she reached him, she placed her hand gently on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the worn flannel. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For showing me what real family looks like, for giving me the best week of my life. Victoria, tell Isabella I'll never forget her butterfly project. Tell her that some butterflies have to fly a long way before they find where they belong, but that doesn't mean the journey wasn't worth it." Before he could respond, before she could lose her nerve entirely, Victoria turned and walked toward the black SUV, where her father waited with the door already open. As the car pulled away from 847 Maple Grove Lane, Victoria pressed her face to the tinted window and watched Somir standing alone in his driveway, surrounded by concerned neighbors but somehow utterly isolated in his helplessness to change what had just happened. In the upstairs window, Isabella's small silhouette remained pressed against the glass, watching the only mother figure she had known in years disappear into the gathering dusk. The Ashford mansion felt like a mausoleum when Victoria returned. The marble floors echoed with the hollow sound of her footsteps as security escorted her through the grand foyer, past the ostentatious crystal chandelier that had never provided any real warmth, and up the sweeping staircase to her suite. The same rooms that had felt suffocating a week ago now felt like a tomb, beautiful, expensive, and utterly devoid of life. Harrison followed her into her sitting room, dismissing the security team with a curt nod. For a moment, father and daughter stood in silence, surrounded by the designer furniture and priceless artwork that had once defined Victoria's world. Everything looked exactly as she had left it, but Victoria felt like she was seeing it all through different eyes. Eyes that had learned to recognize the difference between value and worth. "Hawken, I trust this little adventure has gotten whatever rebellious impulses you had out of your system," Harrison said, settling into the leather armchair that had been positioned to command the best view of the room. "The engagement party is tomorrow evening. Richard's family is flying in from Boston. The media will be present. You'll smile, you'll play the part of the devoted fiancé, and we'll put this embarrassment behind us." Victoria moved to the window that overlooked the estate's perfectly manicured grounds. In the distance, she could see the gardening staff working to prepare the outdoor spaces for tomorrow's event, stringing lights, arranging flowers, creating a picture-perfect backdrop for her picture-perfect life. But all she could think about was Isabella's small vegetable garden, with its crooked rows of carrots and the tomato plants that Sommier had helped her stake with pieces of old wood. "Are you listening to me, Victoria?" She turned to face her father, this man who had shaped every aspect of her existence through a carefully calculated combination of privilege and pressure. "I'm listening, I'll play the part, but I want something in return." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. In 22 years, Victoria had never attempted to negotiate with him. "You're hardly in a position to make demands." "I want to start a foundation," Victoria said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. "A real one. Not another tax write-off or publicity opportunity. Something that actually helps children who need it. Educational programs, after-school services, support for single parents. I want to do work that matters. You'll have plenty of opportunities for charitable work once you're married to Richard. His family has very specific philanthropic interests that align with our business." "No," Victoria interrupted, surprising them both with the firmness in her voice. "Not the Cromwell family's interests. Not Ashford Industries' interests. Mine. I want to help children like Isabella, families like—" She stopped herself before mentioning Somir's name, knowing that any reference to the life she'd left behind would only fuel her father's anger. Harrison studied her for a long moment, his calculating gaze trying to read the change in his daughter. "This is about that construction worker and his child, isn't it? You think you can recreate that little fantasy world of playing house with the common folk? I think I can find a way to honor what they taught me about what actually matters in life, Victoria replied. About using privilege responsibly instead of just accumulating more of it. Romantic nonsense, Harrison dismissed. But if it keeps you compliant and focused on your real responsibilities, I suppose we can arrange for you to have some sort of charitable outlet. Something appropriately structured and supervised, of course. Victoria felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest, the same feeling she'd had countless times before when her father reduced her hopes and dreams to terms of management and control. But this time, something was different. This time, she had experienced what it felt like to be valued for who she was rather than what she represented. She had tasted genuine purpose, authentic connection, love that came without conditions or calculations. "I need some time alone," she said quietly. Harrison nodded and moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "Victoria, I want you to understand something. What happened this week? It was never real. Those people, that life you thought you wanted, it was a temporary fantasy. This is reality. This mansion, this family, this responsibility. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." After he left, Victoria sank onto her bed, still wearing the borrowed clothes she'd put on that morning in Sommier's guest room. The denim jacket still smelled faintly of sawdust and home-cooked meals, and she buried her face in the fabric, allowing herself a moment of private grief for the life she'd been forced to abandon. But as the hours passed, as servants came and went preparing for tomorrow's celebration of her engagement to a man she didn't love, Victoria found herself thinking not about what she had lost, but about what she had gained. 7 days had taught her things about herself that 22 years in the mansion never could. She had discovered her capacity for genuine care, her ability to contribute meaningfully to others' lives, her strength in the face of adversity. She thought about Isabella's question about butterflies having internal compasses, about knowing where they belonged even if they'd never been there before. Maybe her father was right that she couldn't recreate the exact life she'd experienced on Maple Grove Lane. But that didn't mean she had to abandon everything those 7 days had taught her about who she could be. Victoria went to her laptop and began researching. She looked up statistics on single-parent families, educational inequality, after-school program funding. She read about successful community organizations, about people who had used their resources to create real change, rather than just photo opportunities. For the first time in her life, she began to educate herself, not about things that would make her a more appealing socialite, but about problems she might actually be able to help solve. As she worked, her phone buzzed with messages from Richard, from wedding planners, from society friends congratulating her on tomorrow's engagement party. She ignored them all, lost in research about childhood nutrition programs and literacy initiatives. Hours later, as midnight approached, Victoria found herself standing at her window again, looking out at the estate that had always been more prison than home. Tomorrow, she would put on the designer dress that had already been selected for her, wear the smile that had been practiced since childhood, and play the role of the dutiful daughter accepting her predetermined future. But tonight, she was planning something different. Tonight, she was designing a way to carry the lessons of Maple Grove Lane back into her privileged world. If she couldn't live the life she'd discovered, she could at least use her position to create opportunities for others, to experience the kind of genuine community and support she'd found in Sommier and Isabella's home. She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. The Butterfly Foundation, supporting single-parent families through education and community programs. As she wrote, outlining after-school programs and parent support services, educational scholarships, and community gardens, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Silverbrook District Purpose. This wasn't the grand romantic gesture of running away to live a completely different life. This was something more practical and potentially more powerful, using her privilege as a tool for change rather than just personal escape. She thought about Sommier's words on that last night, sitting on his back porch. The trick is figuring out which world you actually want to live in. Maybe she couldn't live in his world, but she could work to make her world more like his. A place where kindness mattered more than connections, where success was measured by the difference you made in others' lives rather than the zeros in your bank account. Victoria worked through the night, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she outlined programs and policies, budgets and implementation strategies. She researched existing organizations she could partner with, identified communities where the need was greatest, began to envision a foundation that would embody everything Isabella and Sommier had taught her about real love and genuine service. By dawn, she had a comprehensive plan for an organization that would help thousands of children and families across the country. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself a week ago, but it was a way to honor that life, to ensure that the love she'd experienced could ripple outward to touch others who needed it. As the sun rose over the Ashford estate, Victoria finally understood what Isabella had meant about butterflies having internal compasses. Sometimes finding where you belonged wasn't about changing your location. It was about changing your purpose, your priorities, your understanding of what it meant to truly live. She might be trapped in this golden cage for now, but she had found a way to transform it into something meaningful. And maybe, someday that transformation would be enough to earn her the freedom to choose where she truly belonged. The engagement party was in 12 hours, but Victoria Ashford had work to do. The engagement party was everything Harrison Ashford had envisioned, a spectacular display of wealth and influence held in the estate's grand ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over arrangements of white orchids and roses that had cost more than most families' annual income. Victoria stood in the receiving line wearing a champagne-colored silk gown that had been selected by her stylist, accepting congratulations from guests who saw her as a beautiful acquisition in a profitable merger rather than a woman celebrating love. Richard Cromwell III stood beside her, impeccably dressed and perfectly charming, playing his role as the devoted fiancé with the same polished performance he brought to board meetings and business negotiations. They looked like the ideal couple. Young, attractive, successful, destined for a life of privilege and power. The photographers captured every staged moment, creating images that would grace society pages and business magazines for weeks to come. But Victoria felt like she was watching the scene from outside her own body, going through the motions while her mind remained focused on the foundation proposal she had finalized that morning. Hidden in her evening bag was a flash drive containing months' worth of work compressed into a single night, detailed plans for the Butterfly Foundation that would transform her inherited wealth into something that could actually change lives. "Victoria, darling, you look absolutely radiant," gushed Margaret Winterbourne, one of her mother's former social circle, air-kissing Victoria's cheeks with practiced precision. "Marriage suits you already." "Thank you, Mrs. Winterbourne," Victoria replied with the smile she had perfected over years of similar events. But as she spoke, her attention was drawn to movement near the ballroom's entrance. Harrison was greeting a late arrival with unusual warmth, a tall man in an ill-fitting rental tuxedo who looked profoundly uncomfortable among the designer gowns and imported champagne. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him despite the formal attire and the obvious attempt to blend into this foreign environment. Sommier de la Vega stood at the edge of the ballroom, his calloused hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the crowd with the careful attention of someone who understood he didn't belong but was determined to complete whatever mission had brought him here. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her father guide Sommier toward a quieter corner of the room, their body language suggesting a conversation of significant importance. What was he doing here? How had he even gained access to the most exclusive social event of the season? And why was Harrison treating him like an honored guest rather than the threat he had represented just 24 hours ago? "Excuse me," Victoria murmured to Richard, who was deep in conversation with a potential business partner about offshore investment opportunities. She slipped away from the receiving line, moving through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had navigated similar events her entire life, but with a desperation that was entirely new. She positioned herself behind a massive floral arrangement where she could observe her father and Sommier without being seen, straining to catch fragments of their conversation over the string quartet and polite society chatter. "Impressive research you've done," Harrison was saying, his tone carrying the same respect he typically reserved for fellow business leaders. "The documentation is quite thorough." Sommier nodded, pulling a manila folder from inside his rented jacket. "It took some time to put together, but I thought you should see it before making any permanent decisions about Victoria's future." Victoria watched her father open the folder, his expression shifting from polite interest to sharp attention as he reviewed whatever documents Sommier had brought. For several minutes, the two men stood in silence while Harrison read, his corporate mask slipping to reveal something Victoria had rarely seen in her father: genuine surprise. "Where did you get this information?" Harrison asked quietly. "I'm a construction foreman," Soumya replied. "I've worked on a lot of projects over the years. You hear things, you see things, you remember them, especially when they involve the safety of children." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Mr. De La Vega, I hope you understand the implications of what you're suggesting." "I understand that 3 children were injured on Ashford Industries construction sites in the past 18 months, Soumya said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. "I understand that safety reports were falsified and inspectors were bribed to overlook code violations. I understand that your company prioritizes profit margins over worker welfare, and that these practices aren't isolated incidents." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. She had always known her father was ruthless in business, but this was different. This was criminal negligence that had hurt children. Exactly the kind of corporate malfeasance that Isabella's innocent wisdom about helping people would find incomprehensible. "What do you want?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone Victoria recognized from hostile takeover negotiations. "I want you to understand that your daughter spent a week with people who actually give a damn about doing the right thing," Soumya replied. "She helped feed hungry children and tutored kids with their homework because she wanted to, not because it would look good in a press release. She found out who she really is when nobody was watching or calculating her worth in stock options." "Get to the point, Mr. De La Vega." Soumya closed the folder and met Harrison's gaze directly. "The point is that Victoria deserves better than being treated like a commodity in your business empire. She deserves the chance to choose her own life, to marry someone she actually loves, to use her talents for something that matters. And if you try to force her into a life that will slowly kill her spirit, these documents find their way to every news outlet and regulatory agency in the country." Victoria pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Soumya had done. He had researched her father's business practices, uncovered evidence of serious wrongdoing, and walked into the lion's den to advocate for her freedom. Not because he wanted anything for himself, but because he believed she deserved better. Harrison studied Soumya for a long moment, and Victoria could practically see the calculations running behind his eyes, weighing the potential damage of a public scandal against the value of maintaining control over his daughter's life. "You could have gone straight to the authorities with this information," Harrison observed, "or sold it to our competitors. Why bring it to me directly?" "Because I'm not interested in destroying anyone," Soumya replied. "I'm interested in protecting someone I care about. Victoria found her way to my door because she was running from a life that was suffocating her. She spent a week discovering who she could be when she's valued for her heart instead of her bank account. She deserves the chance to build on that discovery." "And if I refuse your suggestion?" Soumya's expression didn't change, but something in his posture conveyed absolute resolve. "Then Isabella grows up in a world where powerful men face consequences for putting profit over people's safety. Either way, she'll be better off than she would be if I stayed quiet." Victoria realized that tears were streaming down her cheeks, threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. This man, this good, honest, brave man, was risking everything to give her the freedom she had thought was lost forever. He wasn't asking for anything for himself or for Isabella. He was simply standing up for what was right, the same way he had knelt beside an injured child at a construction site and made sure she was okay. Harrison closed the folder and handed it back to Soumya. "You've made your point, Mr. De La Vega. We'll need to discuss the details, but I believe we can reach an arrangement that serves everyone's interests." "Not everyone's interests," Soumya corrected. "Victoria's interests. That's the only arrangement I'm here to negotiate." As the two men shook hands with the formal courtesy of a business agreement, Victoria felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what love looked like. This wasn't the desperate romance of novels or movies. This was someone caring enough about her happiness to walk into a world where he didn't belong and face down the most powerful man she knew, armed with nothing but truth and an unshakable belief that she deserved better. From across the ballroom, Richard was gesturing for her to return to the receiving line, his smile strained with the impatience of someone who had noticed her absence. The engagement party continued around her, a carefully orchestrated celebration of a future that had been decided without her input or consent. But for the first time since returning to the mansion, Victoria felt something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the naive hope of fairy tale endings, but the practical hope that came from knowing someone was willing to fight for her right to choose her own story. Sommier caught her eye across the room, his expression gentle but determined. He nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both goodbye and promise, before disappearing back into the crowd of guests who would never understand what had just transpired. Victoria touched the flash drive in her evening bag, thinking about the foundation plans that represented her own fight for a meaningful future. Sommier had shown her that sometimes the most powerful acts of love weren't grand gestures, but quiet stands for what was right. Now it was her turn to be brave. 3 hours after the last guest had departed, and the ballroom had been cleared of champagne glasses and wilted orchids, Victoria sat in her father's study, still wearing her engagement party gown, but having long since kicked off the designer heels that had never been meant for comfort. The room felt different in the aftermath of the evening's revelations. The leather-bound books and mahogany furniture that had once symbolized unshakable power now seemed like props in a play where the script had suddenly changed. Harrison sat behind his massive desk, the manila folder Sommier had given him spread open before him. He had been silent for nearly an hour, methodically reviewing documents and making phone calls to lawyers and advisors, his expression growing more troubled with each conversation. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at his daughter with something Victoria had never seen in his eyes before: uncertainty. "The information Mr. De La Vega provided is comprehensive," Harrison said finally, "and unfortunately, accurate. If it becomes public, Ashford Industries faces potential criminal charges, federal investigations, and billions in liability." Victoria felt a surge of something between vindication and sorrow. She had always known her father was ruthless, but seeing the evidence of how that ruthlessness had endangered children made her understand why Sommier had been willing to risk everything to confront him. "But that's not why we're having this conversation," Harrison continued. "We're having it because a construction worker who barely knows you was willing to walk into a room full of the most powerful people in the country and threaten to destroy me unless I gave you the freedom to choose your own life." The admission hung in the air between them, and Victoria saw her father struggling with concepts that were foreign to his worldview: love without calculation, sacrifice without expectation of return, standing up for what was right rather than what was profitable. "He could have sold this information," Harrison said, tapping the folder. "Corporate espionage pays very well." He could have gone directly to prosecutors and positioned himself as a whistleblower hero. Instead, he brought it to me and asked for nothing except your happiness. "I've spent 30 years in business, Victoria, and I've never encountered anything like it." Victoria thought about Sommier sitting on his back porch, talking about how every choice he made was for Isabella's well-being, about building a life where she felt safe enough to sing in the kitchen. That same protective instinct had extended to Victoria, not because he wanted something from her, but because he had seen her worth when no one else bothered to look. "What does this mean?" Victoria asked quietly. Harrison leaned back in his chair, looking older than she had ever seen him. "It means I have a choice to make. I can dig in, fight this, use every resource at my disposal to discredit Mr. De La Vega and force you to go through with the marriage to Richard. But that path likely leads to prison for me and scandal that destroys everything I've built." He paused, studying his daughter's face in the lamplight. "Or I can accept that maybe, just maybe, a man who works with his hands understands something about value that I've forgotten in all my years of accumulating wealth." Victoria felt her heart beating so hard she was certain her father could hear it across the room. After 22 years of having every major decision made for her, the possibility of genuine choice felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "There are conditions," Harrison said, his business instincts reasserting themselves even in surrender. "The engagement to Richard is off. I'll handle the political and financial complications of that decision, but you don't just get to run away and play house. If you want freedom, you have to prove you can handle it responsibly." Victoria nodded, understanding that even this capitulation would come with her father's attempt to maintain some control. "Your foundation idea," Harrison continued, "the butterfly foundation you outlined in that proposal you thought I didn't know about, it becomes real. $50 million in initial funding, full operational autonomy, but you run it like a business. Real oversight, measurable outcomes, accountability for every dollar spent. You want to help children like Mr. De La Vega's daughter? Prove you can do it effectively." The offer was more than Victoria had dared to hope for, but she sensed there was more coming. "And," Harrison added, his voice dropping to the tone he used for the most important negotiations, "you bring Mr. De La Vega onto the Foundation's board of directors. If he's willing to risk everything to advocate for you, then I want his perspective on how to use money to actually help people instead of just accumulating more of it." Victoria stared at her father, hardly able to process what she was hearing. Not only was he offering her freedom, he was actively inviting Somir into their world. Recognizing that the construction worker who had threatened him possessed wisdom that Harrison's Harvard MBA couldn't provide. "Why?" Victoria asked. "Why are you really doing this?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to a photograph on his desk that Victoria had never paid much attention to before. A picture of her mother holding Victoria as a baby, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "Your mother used to tell me that the measure of a man wasn't what he accumulated, but what he was willing to give up for the people he loved," Harrison said quietly. "I thought it was romantic nonsense, but watching Mr. De La Vega tonight, seeing how he was prepared to sacrifice his own security to ensure your happiness, I realized she was trying to teach me something I was too arrogant to learn." He looked up at Victoria, and for the first time in years she saw not the corporate titan or the controlling father, but simply a man who had lost his way and was trying to find his path back to what mattered. "I failed your mother in the end," Harrison continued. "I was so busy building an empire that I forgot to build a family. She died knowing that I valued my company more than our time together. I won't make the same mistake with you." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. Not the careful tears of social obligation, but the raw emotion of a daughter finally seeing her father as a human being capable of growth and change. "Does this mean," she began. "It means you're free to choose, Victoria. Choose where you want to live, who you want to love, how you want to spend your life. But choose wisely, because this is the only inheritance that actually matters, the chance to build something meaningful with the time you have." 6 months later, Victoria stood in the renovated community center in Silverbrook District, watching Isabella and 20 other children from the neighborhood's after-school program perform their spring recital. The Butterfly Foundation had transformed the former warehouse into a space that buzzed with the kind of energy that came from children who felt valued and supported, where single parents could access job training while their kids received tutoring and mentorship. Victoria stared at her father, hardly able to process what she was hearing. Not only was he offering her freedom, he was actively inviting Somir into their world, recognizing that the construction worker who had threatened him possessed wisdom that Harrison's Harvard MBA couldn't provide. "Why?" Victoria asked. "Why are you really doing this?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to a photograph on his desk that Victoria had never paid much attention to before, a picture of her mother holding Victoria as a baby, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "Your mother used to tell me that the measure of a man wasn't what he accumulated, but what he was willing to give up for the people he loved," Harrison said quietly. "I thought it was romantic nonsense. But watching Mr. De La Vega tonight, seeing how he was prepared to sacrifice his own security to ensure your happiness, I realized she was trying to teach me something I was too arrogant to learn." He looked up at Victoria, and for the first time in years, she saw not the corporate titan or the controlling father, but simply a man who had lost his way and was trying to find his path back to what mattered. "I failed your mother in the end," Harrison continued. "I was so busy building an empire that I forgot to build a family. She died knowing that I valued my company more than our time together. I won't make the same mistake with you." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. Not the careful tears of social obligation, but the raw emotion of a daughter finally seeing her father as a human being capable of growth and change. "Does this mean?" she began. "It means you're free to choose, Victoria. Choose where you want to live, who you want to love, how you want to spend your life. But choose wisely, because this is the only inheritance that actually matters, the chance to build something meaningful with the time you have." 6 months later, Victoria stood in the renovated community center in Silverbrook District, watching Isabella and 20 other children from the neighborhood's after-school program perform their spring recital. The Butterfly Foundation had transformed the former warehouse into a space that buzzed with the kind of energy that came from children who felt valued and supported, where single parents could access job training while their kids received tutoring and mentorship,